Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to the Memorial Day edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Today is Monday. It is the 30th day of May, and as everyone who is listening knows, today is Memorial Day, and in fact, my wife just left now to go put some flowers on her parents' grave this afternoon, and I think she kind of thought that I wasn't going to be doing a program today because it was a holiday, and then when I told her I was, she figured that she'd go by herself and just left. And I know a lot of people are doing that today. It is Memorial Day, and it's very important. I know many people intend to watch Memorial Day concerts. I think there's one from Washington D.C. on PBS and later today. So, it is Memorial Day, and I'm anticipating and assuming that everybody appreciates the seriousness of this day, and the contributions of those who have served and those who have paid the ultimate price in that service, and we do here as well. I hope that your weekend has been going great. It is a holiday weekend. The weather here, at least in the East, has been very good, although I know that there's been some absolutely devastating weather, rain, especially in the Midwest and the South, and very, very dangerous tornadoes and all the rest of it. Thank heavens that climate change is only a myth and doesn't really exist, or I'd be nervous. Again, I want to welcome you to a new week of broadcasting here at the Virtual Center, and I do want to invite you to participate actively in our program by sharing your thoughts and your ideas with us. I'd like to begin by returning to a theme that we looked at the last time we were together here at the Virtual Center, which was in the middle of last week. We were looking at the idea of anti-intellectualism and focusing specifically on Richard Hofstadter's 1964 Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Anti-Intellectualism in American Life. And since then, I've come across, and again, I have a couple of listeners to thank for this, a link that a couple of different people independently sent to me toward the end of last week, which I think provides some pretty significant data to the anti-intellectualism issue. And I kind of made up my mind when I saw this, that it would be well worth our time for me to at least share a little bit of this data with you. It's somewhat outdated in the sense that the source was an article in the publication Psychology Today, and it was printed a couple of years ago, 2014, and some of the data goes back prior to 2010. But at the same time, it's very, very relevant data, and it seems to me really addresses the severity and the breadth of the issue of anti-intellectualism. So I'd like to begin there. And then I'd like to move into something that I've done a little bit of writing about on our Facebook page, and I'll get to the address in a moment. But those of you who do regularly look at our Facebook page have probably seen these. I've put 2 entries on Facebook over the last 3 or 4 days related to the issue of corporations. And I really wanted to get into this issue today. It's a relatively new issue, and I think it'll probably take us the bulk of the program. I think it's that significant. Obviously, corporations are pretty significant in our contemporary way of life, especially here in America. So I do believe that this is a topic quite worthy of our time here at the Virtual Center, because a major issue, of course, that we continue to go around and around about is the issue of whether, in fact, there is some sort of regulatory mechanism possible in order to regulate the behavior of corporations, and we'll get into that a little bit in our program today. Again, I do invite you to participate actively in our programs by sharing your thoughts and your ideas with the rest of our listeners as well as with me. We do have a phone number, and we have it there for exactly that purpose. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. And if you call that number, you will get into the Head On Radio Network studios. Bob Kincaid will immediately put you on the air, and we'll chat and give you an opportunity to share your thoughts and your ideas with our listener on some of the issues that we have been dealing with and will be dealing with here at the Virtual Center. If you are a little bit reluctant to go on the air, and I can understand why people might be, I try to discourage you from being concerned or worried about that, but at the same time, I know that there are some people who would be very uncomfortable, would feel very uncomfortable, and that's the last thing we want to do is make you uncomfortable. So if you would rather just jot your ideas down in an email and send them to me personally, I would love to receive them, and I'll kind of reserve the right to put them on the air, if they seem to be pretty pertinent and ideas and substance that our listeners would benefit from. My email address is waobrien906 @gmail.com. That's waobrien, OBRIEN 906 @gmail.com. And again, our Facebook page. We've had it now for about 6 months, maybe a little bit longer. We continue to get new likes and new people reading it, and that's good. I have taken to try to put some opinion-driven pieces on the Facebook page. Many of them are based on programs we've done here at the Virtual Center. Some of them are on issues that I've read and shared with you here. Many of them focus, as is the mission of our program, on the nature of the Constitution, on the Federalist Papers, and a lot of the 18th century primary source material that we feature here at the Virtual Center. So if you are a regular user of Facebook and you just go to the homepage, in the search box, just type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, and you will be into our Facebook page. And as you scroll down, you will see a number of entries there. The most recent ones first, and then they go in terms of reverse chronological order. So the older ones are toward the end as you scroll down. And as you know, many of them will have 4 or 5 lines from a posting, and then have a link which says read more. And if you click it, you get the entire posting. And I would encourage you to do that, especially if some of these issues do strike your fancy and seem to be something that you would enjoy and you would benefit from reading and perhaps doing a little out-of-the-box thinking on some of these things. So again, just go to the homepage of Facebook, go to the search box, and type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. One of the entries that I put on Facebook 3 or 4 days ago, I think it was would have been last Thursday, I believe, was a small piece on the current election campaign. And I'll kind of date it for you. It was the 26th day of May. Today's the 30th, so it was 4 days ago. And what I was really reacting to was the attack, Donald Trump's attack on the Republican governor of New Mexico, Susana Martinez, I believe her name was. And you'll recall that in one of his rallies, he really took issue with her performance as governor. And it got a lot of traction in the media because not only is this particular governor a Republican, not only is she a woman, but she is also Hispanic. In fact, many people will classify her as one of the most prominent, noted Republican Hispanic women in the country today. And many people believe that she's been a very successful governor of New Mexico. Anyway, she was a little bit taken aback, I would guess, by Donald Trump's pointed attack on her performance as governor. And that same day, he tore into Bernie Sanders as well. And of course, that's one of the things that I think was going on last week. If you've been following the election campaign, I know almost everyone listening has, was the degree to which Donald Trump began to recognize and acknowledge the candidacy of Bernie Sanders. He's been taking aim for the last couple of weeks, as many of us know, on Hillary Clinton as the presumptive nominee of the Democratic Party. But last week, as you know, Bernie challenged Donald Trump to a debate, and this was in response to a comment about such a debate that Donald Trump had made on late night television on ABC with Jimmy Kimmel. And the Sanders campaign picked it up and accepted the gauntlet, at which time Donald Trump backed out of such a debate, kind of blowing Bernie Sanders off by suggesting that he doesn't debate losers. But there is some question as to whether, in fact, Donald Trump actually believed that he could gain anything from such a debate, and on the contrary, seemed to have more to lose than to gain. And so logistics, common sense told him that the best strategy for him was to back out of the proposed debate. And in the course of that give and take, Donald Trump said some pretty negative things about Bernie Sanders. And of course, with Donald Trump, the badge of courage, so to speak, when you get on his hit list, so to speak, the badge of courage is the fact, or badge of significance, maybe is more appropriate term, is when he assigns you a label. So he began talking last week about Crazy Bernie. So along with Little Marco, if you remember, and Lion Ted, and Crooked Hillary, last week we heard about Crazy Bernie. And we also heard criticism of Governor Martinez of New Mexico. I put a relatively short entry on Facebook. But my point was that whereas Trump's hit list in the past seemed to be very targeted, when his major opponent was Chris Christie, he became the focus of the barbs. When Marco Rubio he became the focus. So also with Jeb Bush and his so-called weakness and lack of enthusiasm. But last week with Governor Martinez and Bernie Sanders, it kind of almost seemed to be open season, and that's what I put on there. It's kind of like a form of democracy, attack everybody. And of course, after I wrote that, just in the last 48 hours or so, Donald Trump made a very negative comment about the libertarian candidate for the vice presidency, former governor of Massachusetts, Weld, and made reference to his supposed alcoholism. And I don't know that much about Weld as to whether, in fact, he has problems with alcohol or not. But I'm guessing that there may be something to it, because Donald responded to an attack by Weld on his immigration policy by suggesting, I didn't attack him for his alcoholism. Why is he attacking me? Or something to that effect. So it's clear that Donald is in total control of his own campaign, and whether in fact these things are coming from advisors or whether in fact they're just coming from him is pretty much hard to tell. But the campaign continues to get more and more heated as we go. There's quite a bit of quite a number of people, pro-Democrats, who are urging Bernie to think about getting out, because the argument is the longer he stays in there, the more difficult it is for Hillary to concentrate on Donald Trump. And, the argument being, of course, that Hillary's securing the nomination is pretty much a done deal, a foregone conclusion. Bernie continues to insist, at least to his most avid followers, that there's a possibility, an assumption, that many of these superdelegates at the last minute will shift their allegiance from Hillary to him. And so some people are beginning to question whether, in fact, this is going to do enough damage to Hillary that it could actually benefit Donald Trump in the long run. I know there are some people who are beginning to believe that things like the email controversy that won't go away for Hillary raise some serious questions about whether, in fact, Hillary's what used to be seen as Hillary's overwhelming lead and overwhelming projected victory against Donald Trump. The fact of the matter is, many people now are beginning to seriously question that and wonder whether Hillary is really going to be able to shake the email controversy and other things, Benghazi and the rest of them. There's absolutely no question that anything that will serve a political purpose in this campaign seems to be a go. There doesn't seem to be any issues or any presentation or any perspective that would be considered to be off limits or a low blow or anything like that, as we traditionally. I think this campaign seems to suggest more and more of that. So I'm sure we'll be back to it over and over again. It would be kind of remiss of us not to, and especially as we dip back into the 18th century and we begin to see some of the historical origins of much of this, the origins of parties and the rest of it. I think, I hope that those of you who have been regular listeners here at the Virtual Center will hopefully have been able to develop a perspective and a depth of understanding as a result of this program. That's the purpose of it. That's what I'm trying to accomplish, and I hope we've been successful. I know those of you who have been with us and continue to stay with us are, in effect, sending a message that there is value to this. And, of course, it's that assumption that keeps me going. So with that, I want to welcome you again on this Memorial Day, and I want to thank you for your continued support of the Virtual Center, and equally or even more so your support of the Head On Radio Network. I know that there are financial considerations and concerns that Bob Kincaid raises all the time. It's a serious matter. It's not a lot of money that's necessary to keep this program on the air, but it does require a relatively steady flow. And I know that fundraising seems to encompass more and more of Bob's time on his program at night. I know he doesn't like that any more than any of us like it. But on the other hand, there seems to be, at this point, little alternative. So I hope that you will understand and that you will continue to support the Head On Radio Network and the programs which that network brings to us. And I think all of these programs accomplish something that we couldn't get anywhere else. And I know that many of you regular, longtime supporters and listeners to the Head On Radio Network appreciate that, and you continue to support it. And I just want you to know how much I appreciate it, and I know Bob does as well. So again, thank you. I did want to go back, as I mentioned in the introduction today, I did want to go back to the issue of anti-intellectualism a little bit. I don't want to necessarily do a whole lot more with it than we did, but I don't believe that you can revisit Richard Hofstadter's monumental study. And by monumental study, I don't mean length. I mean depth and insight. Because I think what he does in talking about anti-intellectualism is introduce a perspective and a concept into our political debates and dialogue in this country, which are very important. It helps to explain an awful lot of what happens in our politics. This negativism towards scholarship, towards scholars, the assumption that scholars are elitists and that those people with a superior higher education seem to see themselves as a cut above the rest of us, and consequently that creates a sense of negativism and bitterness, which is reflected not only in our contemporary political world, but has indeed gone quite a bit back in our history. And Richard Hofstadter makes that point very well in this well-researched book. I mentioned that a couple of listeners sent me a link to an article that appeared in Psychology Today in June of 2014. So it's just about 2 years ago. Actually, the date was Saturday, September 7th, 2014. So just about 2 years ago, this particular article appeared in Psychology Today. It's an article by Ray Williams, and the title of it was The Cult of Ignorance in the United States, Anti-Intellectualism and the Dumbing Down of America. And I think many of us have seen studies, have seen references to this issue of the dumbing down of America. We continue to see it every time here at the Virtual Center when we seem to go back and touch on the issue of education. We seem to be talking about some aspect of dumbing down. We've been talking about in recent months as we've witnessed the attacks on the Common Core and looked at some of the basis for those particular attacks. I'm going to mention a few of the sources. What makes this article, I think, as I mentioned in the introduction, what makes this article particularly valuable, it seems to me, is that it's rich in data and rich in sources. In other words, if you wanted to do something on the issue of anti-intellectualism, you could pick up this particular piece and probably come up with a bibliography that would really cover the lot in terms of intellectualism. And of course, right near the top is Richard Hofstadter's book, Anti-Intellectualism in American Life, which won the Pulitzer Prize in 1964. Many of you may be familiar with a book that came out a few years ago by Susan Jacoby entitled The Age of American Unreason. I think that title is very, very significant. The Age of American Unreason. And of course, this ties directly into the idea that anti-intellectualism seems to be, in part at least, a rebellion against the ideas and the thinking of the so-called Enlightenment. And again, not so much on the ideas, although that's significant, but also on the individuals who comprise the Enlightenment. Those people who buy into the key issues associated with the Enlightenment: reason, analysis, experience, research, data, evidence, the pursuit of truth, and the extent to which the Enlightenment constitutes a challenge or an attack on traditional sources of truth. Namely, if you go back to the emergence of the Enlightenment in the beginning of the modern period, the beginning of what becomes the scientific revolution, you begin to see that much of what becomes the Enlightenment emerged in opposition to the power and control over men's thinking in the hands of religious leaders during the Middle Ages and thereafter. And so the assumption, the idea being that many people believe that the source of truth is in Scripture, or depending on the particular religious denomination, something tantamount to Scripture. And the idea of reason, man's ability to reason and to understand and know what the medieval period believed and argued was unknowable, because to know it is to get into the mind of God, and that's impossible. So the assumption is that those people who advocate the search for truth through reason are in effect violating the commandment, which says that I am the Lord thy God, and thou shalt not have strange gods before me. That man's emphasis on reason as a vehicle to know truth is, in the minds of many people, arrogant and elitist, an effort to elevate man to the point that man claims to be godlike. Only God can understand and know truth. And the only way that we can know truth is by going to God in order to find out what that truth is through Scripture. And so Susan Jacoby's book, The Age of American Unreason, suggests the rejection of reason and the rejection of the Enlightenment. Susan Jacoby wrote an article in the Washington Post, and I'm going to read the quote from that article because I think it pretty much, it's a source that I think all of us might find helpful. So again, you might, if you are interested in this subject of anti-intellectualism, you might jot down Susan Jacoby in The Age of American Unreason and look at the Washington Post for the following quote. Dumbness, she says, to paraphrase the late Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, dumbness has been steadily defined downward for several decades by a combination of heretofore irresistible forces. These include the triumph of video culture over print culture, a little bit of a cough break there, I apologize. This dumbing down, if you will, of dumbness includes, Moynihan said, the triumph of video culture over print culture. People have turned to video, to television, and away from books, away from the printed word. A disjunction between America's rising level of formal education and their shaky grasp of basic geography, science, and history, and the fusion of anti-rationalism with anti-intellectualism. Anti-intellectualism is a rejection of reason and science and the scientific method, but even more than that, it tends to become a rejection of the people who subscribe to reason and research and all the rest of it. Mark Borrelline, who teaches literature, and I can't remember offhand, I think it's Purdue University, but I'm not really sure. Mark Borrelline has written a book called The Dumbest Generation. And he talks in that book about how an entire generation of young people is being dumbed down by their aversion to reading anything of substance and their addiction to what he calls digital crap via social media. The inability to distinguish the relevant from the irrelevant, the substance from fluff, as it were. Charles Pierce, many of you may have seen Charles Pierce on various television talk programs. Charles Pierce wrote a book entitled Idiot America. And here's a couple of quotations from Charles Pierce. The rise of idiot America today represents, for profit mainly, but also and more cynically for political advantage in the pursuit of power, the breakdown of a consensus that the pursuit of knowledge is a good. I read that quote because I really want to focus attention on that particular sentence. What Charlie Pierce is saying is that anti-intellectualism is based principally on what he calls a breakdown of a consensus. There used to be a consensus throughout society that pursuing knowledge was a good thing. Now what he's talking about, what he's referencing, is the fact that part of the anti-intellectualism that we see in today's world is an attack on that consensus, is a rejection, or at least questioning, the value of the pursuit of knowledge itself. He attributes this to what he calls the rise of idiot America. He said it also represents the ascendancy of the notion that the people whom we should trust the least are the people who know best what they're talking about. In the new media age, everybody is an expert, unquote, says Charles Pierce. In other words, the people who know less are the people that speak the most often. And you see them interviewed in a number of panels over and over and over again. Charles Pierce goes on and says the following: there's a prevalent suspicion of rights, privileges, knowledge, and specialization. We don't educate people anymore, we train them to get a job, says Catherine Liu, the author of a book called American Idol, Academic Anti-Elitism as Cultural Critique. These are some of the major sources: Idiot America, The Age of American Unreason, Anti-Intellectualism in American Life, The Dumbest Generation. These are some of the major sources. Let's look at some of the data, because I think what makes this particular article from Psychology Today relevant, it seems to me, to this topic, is the data that it presents. And again, some of it is dated, but I still think it's significant. For example, this is data from the World Economic Forum. After leading the world for decades in 25 to 34-year-olds with university degrees, the United States is now 12th in that category. For years, we used to lead the world in those adults with college degrees. Now we're behind. We're 12th. The World Economic Forum ranked the United States 52nd among 139 nations in the quality of its university math and science instruction in 2010. In other words, let me put that into focus. The World Economic Forum reported in 2010 that the quality of math and science instruction in American universities was 52nd among 139 nations studied. And here's a piece of information. I think many of us know this, but I think it's significant as well. 50% of all graduate students in the sciences in the United States come from countries other than the United States. They are from nations around the world. Half of the most highly educated talent in the nation comes to us from overseas for the quality of our graduate education. I've seen this data before. I think most of us have heard it. The Oklahoma Council of Public Affairs commissioned a study on civic education among public school students. 77% didn't know that George Washington was the first president. Many couldn't name Thomas Jefferson as author of the Declaration. This is data that a lot of us have heard before. Only 2.8% of students actually passed a citizenship test. The Goldwater Institute in Phoenix conducted the same survey, and they found 3.5% of students passed this civics test. According to the National Research Council, 28% of high school science teachers, only 28% of high school science teachers consistently followed the National Research Council guidelines on teaching evolution. That means that 72% of high school science teachers do not follow the National Research Council's guidelines on teaching evolution. 13% of these teachers teach and advocate intelligent design, creationism. According to a Gallup poll, 18% of Americans believe that the sun revolves around the earth. Most of us know that Galileo put that to rest some time ago. But there are significant numbers, 18% of Americans, who haven't gotten word yet. The American Association of State Colleges and Universities shows that the United States ranks second among all nations in the proportion of the population 35 to 64 with a college degree, but 19th in the percentage of those aged 25 to 34 with an associate degree or a high school diploma. I want to flag this one. I'm going to read you exactly what this document says. This data means, it says, that America ranks second among nations in terms of the proportion of the population between the ages of 35 and 64 with a college degree, but America ranks 19th in the percentage of those aged 25 to 34 with an associate degree or a high school diploma, which means that for the first time, the educational attainment of young people will be lower than their parents. It means a lot more than that. It seems to suggest to me that we are becoming a class system as reflected in higher education. We rank second in the world in the proportion of our people with college degrees, but 19th in the ranking of those with associate degrees or high school diplomas. The gap between the educated and the non-educated, it seems to me, is revealed from that data and becomes irrefutable. In 2009, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, the so-called NAEP results, 68% of public school children in the United States do not read proficiently by the time they finish the third grade. This is in 2009. 68%. More than 2/3 of American third graders do not read proficiently by the time they complete third grade. This is one piece of information that I'd like to share with you because I think this is significant. According to the National Endowment for the Arts, in 1982, 82% of college graduates read novels or poems for pleasure. In 2002, only 67% did. In other words, in 20 years, the percentage of college graduates who read for pleasure declined from 82% to 67%. More than 40% of Americans under the age of 44 did not read a single book over the last year. The proportion of 17-year-olds who read nothing unless assigned by their school has doubled from 1984 to 2004. I find some of this data absolutely astounding. And there's more. One of the things I'd like to call your attention to is something that I mentioned last week when we dealt with anti-intellectualism, and here it is in print. And it is the extent to which the media tends to depict intellectuals as being geeks and usually effeminate. I ask you to think of the Big Bang Theory. Every time I watch that, it kind of reinforces that particular message. And there's so much more data in this particular article. It seems to me that what we have here is the kind of evidence which seems to indicate the emergence of anti-intellectualism in America. And we're seeing it reflected in the current election campaign prominently. I don't know whether it's going too far to go out on a limb and say more than any other campaign before, but there's absolutely no question. Candidates are comfortable playing fast and loose with the facts. If they make a mistake, oftentimes they'll say, "Oh, I'm sorry," or "It was just a mistake," or the data, doesn't really matter. The accuracy of the data does not really matter. And how different this is from other culture. This particular article focuses on Japan and the culture of Japan and the emphasis on scholarship and the respect for scholarship and for those who practice it in Japan as opposed to here. There's some material here in this particular article on Bill Keller. Bill Keller writes for the New York Times. He used to have a regular op-ed piece for a number of years, and then I believe Bill Keller was promoted into the editor of the Sunday Review for the New York Times or some such publication. Anyway, he talks about anti-intellectualism and points out that it's not elitism of wisdom, education, experience, or knowledge. Rather, it tends to be a collection of angry social media posters. Those who can shout the loudest and shout most often. A clique of bullies and malcontents. Now, this is 2014. This is before the current election campaign even started. Bullies and malcontents. People who basically seek to get their way, not by reason, not by common sense, not by evidence, but by their ability to shout and bully their way into victory in debates and the rest of it. I think all of it suggests a real problem. Not only does it bode ill for education, this is just me talking generally now, but one of the things that concerns me the most about this issue is that not only do we get a measurement or to begin to see trends in terms of those people who are engaged in and practicing anti-intellectualism in America, but what it also suggests is how difficult and uncomfortable this makes it for those who really would be scholars, those who continue to value education, value research, value common sense and reason, and want to know more. All of our employers, all of our major corporations claim that they want people with particular attitudes. It's becoming more and more difficult to find those people. It's becoming more and more difficult for those people to self-identify because many of them don't want to identify themselves because of the negativism that will be directed their way because of it. So not only is anti-intellectualism on the rise, but the degree of political power associated with this anti-intellectualism tends to be repressing scholarship and tends to be silencing the scholar, silencing those who generate the kind of evidence that we need in order to make good decisions. And I think social media is a reflection of that. Think of the emphasis on Twitter, the extent to which people communicate in 140 characters or less. Think about what that means in its full implications, in terms of scholarship, in terms of understanding, in terms of the ability to make a point and support it. Let me give you just one personal example, and then I'll drop this. But this just happened over the last couple of days, and I wanted to share it with you. You'll remember that about a week ago, 2 weeks ago, here at the Virtual Center, we were focusing on the link or a connection between the policies and positions of Bernie Sanders and some of the substance from the writings of James Madison. And specifically, what we were talking about particularly were the criticisms of Bernie Sanders as a socialist and the assumption that the telltale sign of socialism is support for what we called, for lack of a better term, redistribution of wealth. What we did is we looked at documents and letters from James Madison, who talked about the importance of government regularly addressing the potential gap between rich and poor in order to repress inequality in American society if republicanism is to be successful. Madison pointed out in the letter that appeared in the National Gazette in 1792 that in order for republicanism to be successful in America, government had to consciously adopt policies and programs designed to find ways to repress inequality in society, find ways to close the gap between the rich and the poor, which is exactly the same thing that Bernie Sanders is saying. Anyway, the point of my story, we spent quite a bit of time on that. And I wrote an article, and I based it, as many of you who listen to this program will remember, on a local talk show host here in West Virginia named Hoppy Kercheval, and his criticism of Bernie Sanders for his quixotic socialist ideas and for his efforts to trim down the edges of capitalism. And that's, that particular article I used as a jump-off point to introduce the writings of James Madison. I submitted that for publication. And what the editor did was, because Hoppy Kercheval's article, the original article, appeared not in the Charleston Gazette, which is the liberal paper, but the Daily Mail, which is generally has been always much more conservative. Since Hoppy Kercheval's original piece occurred in the Daily Mail, the editor chose to take my submission and offer it to the Daily Mail. I didn't have a problem with that at all, except that I received notice from the editor at the Daily Mail telling me that the article that I wrote needed to be trimmed by 2/3. And that an article which was about 1,200 words needed to be cut down to something in the area of 300 to 400 words. And I for a while I tried. And then I kind of threw up my hands and said, wait a minute. I'm not sure I want to do this anymore, because I was, like budget cutting. You can cut and cut and cut and trim the fat, but ultimately you get right down to the bone and the cuts become substantive. I found that to be quite similar when you're shortening a particular piece of writing. You can find ways to cut it down. Oftentimes, I would say not only oftentimes, most times, one's writing is approved by finding ways to cut it down and reduce it and make your points a little bit more definitively and a little bit more clearly. But by 2/3, and I thought to myself, the only way to submit this particular piece in 1/3 the length was to either eliminate Hoppy Kercheval or eliminate James Madison. But in 350 to 400 words, I didn't feel that there was a way to introduce both. And I felt that I would be doing more damage to the content than the situation warranted. So I notified the editor that I was going to pass on this one. And it turned out that I ended up submitting the piece in another publication. And it did run this past weekend. But again, the issues associated with intellectualism and anti-intellectualism are significant. Because by definition, intellectualism requires substance and argument and documentation and evidence. Otherwise, it's empty rhetoric. And it seems to me, making sure that we do not interchange or intermarry rhetoric for substance. By definition, substance takes time. It requires organization and argument and presentation. And you can't do that. You can't intellectualize on Twitter in 140 words. All you can do is express your opinion. But increasingly, the fact that so many people are doing that is causing society at large to conflate, to confuse opinion with substance. And we've seen in past programs the results of that process. I didn't want my own writing to fall victim to that kind of a situation. So I chose to pass on this particular job of editing down my own writing. I just felt like I had to. It would be a disservice to not only to Hoppy Kercheval, it would have been a disservice to James Madison. And my respect for the writing and the mind of James Madison seems to me to demand that his rationale and his thinking be revealed in what I write about him. And if I cut too much, I can't do that. So, but my point is that I think what we're seeing are the kinds of pressure, the kinds of pressures, and the kinds of criteria that are being imposed, and what that is doing to the issues of scholarship and research and the pursuit of knowledge and all the other things that we take for granted as part of our educational process. I think the data that was presented in the Psychology Today article indicates that there is clearly a blurring of the difference between substance and opinion. And there are serious questions and challenges being raised, Charlie Pierce says, to the pursuit of knowledge. People are actually beginning to question whether the pursuit of knowledge is a good, is a social good, is a positive, is something that society ought to encourage and respect. And if we expect our young people to value education and to put in the sweat equity necessary to become participants in an educated society, then it seems to me we're sending the wrong message. And our political campaign, it seems to me, is doing pretty much the same thing. I notice as I look at the clock that we're about 3 or 4 minutes from the top of the hour. And I think before we begin a totally new subject, this might be the appropriate time to take our 5-minute break between segments. It's 57 minutes after the hour. So why don't we pause now, and then we can begin at the top of the hour with a totally new topic, which deals with the issue of corporations. You're listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. We're going to pause for a 5-minute break. We'll be right back just a minute or two beyond the top of the hour. This is Bill O'Brien. Please stay with us. We'll be right back. Thank you, Bob Kincaid. Welcome back to our second hour. We're 2 minutes after the top of the hour. And if you are just joining us on this Memorial Day, I want to thank you for joining us. My guess is that we might have some people listening in today who don't usually listen, people who are working during the day and pick up the program later on an archive presentation. And I do remind you that you can get archives of all of our broadcasts at whiterosesociety.org, or thanks to our listener Horst in Taiwan, on YouTube as well. Each of them is listed there by date, and obviously the most recent ones at the top. And I do invite you to pick up previous programs that you might have missed, or that you might have had received reference to. You can pick them all up. They are all there. There's more than 3 years of archive presentations there. Well over 100, probably approaching 200 hours of broadcasting. I do remind you of our phone number, and I do encourage you to participate in our program by giving us a call and sharing your thoughts and your ideas with our listeners. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. If you'd like to communicate via email with me personally, I would love to hear from you. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. And again, I do remind you of our Facebook page. If you go to Facebook, if you are a regular user, go to the home page, and in the search box, just type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, and you will have access to the Virtual Center Facebook page. And I invite you to look down at some of the opinion pieces that are posted there and take the opportunity to comment on them or react to them. as you choose. I look forward to hearing from you in all of those areas. If you are just joining us, we spent the first hour, most of it at least, looking at an article in the June 24th edition of Psychology Today, June 7th, 2014, an article on anti-intellectualism and the dumbing down of American society. And we looked at a number of sources contained in that article. So if the topic of anti-intellectualism is one you would like to pursue, then I do encourage you to, first of all, to go to Richard Hofstadter's book, Anti-Intellectualism in American Life, Pulitzer Prize winner from 1964, as one of the best sources, the most reputable sources available on this particular topic. It seems to me, if you do go to Psychology Today, June 7th, 2014, for this article that we looked at by Ray Williams, you will find in it references to a number of other sources, much more timely, much more recent than Hofstadter's. And we mentioned in our first hour Susan Jacoby's book, The Age of American Unreason. We looked at Mark Borreline's book, The Dumbest Generation. We looked at Charlie Pierce's book, Idiot America. And we looked at some of the data contained in this article by various research groups who are constantly doing surveys to try to demonstrate the expansion, the growth, and the dangers of anti-intellectualism in America. I think if you watch our contemporary election campaign in some depth, it's really hard to believe that you don't recognize or see evidences of anti-intellectualism all over the place. In the debates, in the extent to which people are dredging information and allegations and charges without evidence, people are manufacturing the facts, they're taking things issues out of context, putting words in people's mouths that they didn't say, and on and on and on. And it seems to me the only way to expect people to catch that is if they know. And the only one they can know is with an education system where education and the pursuit of knowledge is respected. And the whole idea of anti-intellectualism suggests that level, that degree of respect for scholarship and the pursuit of knowledge seems to be in more question today than ever. Charlie Pierce has made the point in the quote we read that people are actually beginning to challenge the consensus in America that the pursuit of knowledge is a good thing. Some people are questioning that and wondering whether it's worth it, whether it's a waste of time, whether it has any value. Why should we subject our young people to that kind of an exercise when there's no payoff, no apparent payoff at the end? So I think the topic is a valid one. It's one that I think all of us need to keep an eye open for and to note it where it becomes unquestioned. I mentioned that the other topic, and I'm sure we'll have to pursue this particular issue into tomorrow's program as well. The other topic I wanted to deal with is the issue of the corporation. I've posted 2 items on Facebook over the last few days on the issue of corporations. And I want to share with you where this comes from. In 2004, a Canadian law professor and scholar named Joel Bakan, B-A-K-A-N, published a book on the corporation, more particularly on the extent to which corporations as institutions value and promote the characteristics of psychopathology. Let me repeat this. The extent to which corporations as institutions value the very ingredients that we associate with the behavior of psychopaths. There's no way in the world that kind of a lead-in didn't draw my attention. And in fact, we find that Joel Bakken's book was written in 2003. I think I said 2004. The movie on which the book was written, the movie was produced in 2004, and it was a winner for the documentary of the year at the Sundance Film Festival in 2004. The release date for the book was 2003. The title of the book, The Pathological Pursuit of Profit and Power, The Corporation, The Pathological Pursuit of Profit and Power. Let me read, this is from the internet, on the summary of Joel Bakken's book. Bakken's book, this says, is a brilliantly argued account of the corporation's pathological pursuit of profit and power. An eminent law professor and legal theorist, Bakken contends that the corporation is created by law to function much like a psychopathic personality whose destructive behavior, if left unchecked, lead to scandal and ruin. The book I would suggest to you is one that I have not read it yet, I have to admit that, but I've been reading so much about it and collecting information on it. I think it's one that I'm putting at the top of my list of must-reads. In the book are addressed Nobel-winning economist Milton Friedman, Peter Drucker, Noam Chomsky. Let me share with you one of the findings that lead me to want to read this book. Chapter 4 of the book, The Corporation, by Joel Bakken, deals with the New Deal. More specifically, it deals with society's efforts, government's efforts to regulate, manage, and control the behavior and activities of corporations in America. Throughout the 19th century, the late 19th century, corporations became a popular form of organizing for investors, for business. Corporations became models for ways to raise substantial amounts of capital for major projects, roads, railroads, canals, later airports, airlines. In other words, the kind of expenditures that would necessitate, that would demand so much available capital that no one or no few individuals theoretically would be able to come up with enough money to do it. The corporation becomes a mechanism to raise money by soliciting investments from prospective investors. By definition, these investors are just that. They are investors. Their goal is profit. And in the process, they become shareholders in the corporation. One of the things that Bakken points out is that satisfying the shareholders by necessity becomes the number one priority of corporations, not serving the public interest. This is the key. Most of us would assume that by definition, a corporation which is recognized and legitimized by government, because through government laws, corporations are incorporated. The reason that government incorporates corporations is because the assumption is that the corporation is going to provide a service which is in the public interest. That tends to lead us to believe, naturally, that satisfying or serving the public interest becomes the principal rationale for corporate behavior. That the thinking would naturally be that if a corporation is not fulfilling the public interest goals for which the corporation was created, was chartered, if you will, then government, as the representative of the people, theoretically ought to be able to go in and manage corporate behavior in such a way that the original goals of incorporation are addressed and are being addressed and fulfilled. If a corporation was created to serve the public interest, and if after some times the conclusion is drawn that this particular corporation is not serving the public interest, then one would logically assume that government, as the people's agent, ought to have the right to go in and regulate and manage the corporation in order to fulfill the original mission for which it was chartered, for which it was incorporated. Joel Bakken's book points out that that is not true, and that from the very beginning, corporations were created principally as independent entities, free of government regulation, left free to do their own thing, so to speak. And that thing, as it were, is what will best satisfy the shareholders. It's the priorities of the shareholders, not the priorities of the public at large, that become the number one priority of corporations. That's the principal message of Bakken's book. Not only that, but Bakken argues that in order to fulfill its obligation to investors, to shareholders, corporations by definition must, not choose to, but must value the behavior of psychopaths. Behavior that individuals that we would medically diagnose as psychopaths would exhibit. Let me share with you some of those characteristics. I'm getting my paperwork straight here. In his book, Bakken identifies characteristics of a psychopath. I think these are characteristics all of us can understand and appreciate. This is directly from the book. Included in the characteristics of a psychopath are a callous unconcern for the feelings of others. One of the characteristics of psychopathic behavior we hear all the time is that psychopaths don't seem to have a conscience. They don't seem to distinguish between right and wrong or good and bad. Whatever works for them at a particular period in time is justified in their view. Consequently, psychopaths oftentimes engage in behavior which are abhorrent to society at large. Bakken tells us that one of the key characteristics of the psychopath is a callous unconcern for the feelings of others, an incapacity to maintain enduring relationships. Human relationships, by definition, are relationships of convenience to the psychopath. Psychopaths enter relationships for what they can give them, what they can deliver. In other words, and this is a term that we haven't used for a while here at the Virtual Center, but those of you who've been with us for some time will recognize this term because we spent a couple of programs on it some time ago. The idea of Gesellschaft. Remember Ferdinand Tunney's book, Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft, the ideal community versus the ideal society. Gesellschaft is the epitome of modern society. In an ideal Gesellschaft, human relationships are seen as relationships as matters of convenience. There's nothing emotional, nothing substantive to them. Psychopaths, are able to move from relationship to relationship with rather cold dispassion, as it were. So, in other words, Bakken points out that one of the characteristics of a psychopath is the incapacity to maintain enduring relationships, a reckless disregard for the safety of others. If it fulfills my purpose, my goals, my intent, then whatever risks it might present to other people, so be it. Because the most important thing to me, the psychopath, is pursuing my own objectives. And other characteristics of psychopathic behavior: deceitfulness, repeated lying and cheating people for profit. If people are in profit-focused enterprises, then the pursuit of profit, by definition, is the only good. It's the only positive good. And so consequently, every decision reached is a decision designed to lead to that good, which in this case would be profit. So that means being deceitful, lying, or cheating people in order to secure profit. To the psychopath, there's nothing wrong with. If it works, it's legitimate. Also associated with psychopathology, an incapacity to experience guilt. Psychopaths, by definition, have no conscience. They are incapable of feeling sorry for doing something, or sorry for other people. In other words, psychopaths are able to repress their emotions and to elevate reason, logic, manipulation, maneuvering, common sense, rationalism to the top of the scale. Yet another characteristic of the psychopath: failure to conform to social norms with respect to lawful behavior. What the law says, what the law is inconsequential. What counts is what I'm after. And if the law doesn't permit me to pursue it, then I find that I must go outside the law. By definition, the psychopath has no conscience. We know that in our criminal justice system, psychopathic behavior is a major issue. Those of you who are regular viewers of Law and Order, for example, will find episodes of that program which will feature criminal behavior that seems to be driven by a note of psychopathic behavior. So again, let me go back and review those for a moment. Callous unconcern for the feeling of others. Incapacity to maintain enduring relationships. Reckless disregard for the safety of others. Deceitfulness, repeated lying and cheating people for profit. Incapacity to experience guilt. Failure to conform to social norms with respect to lawful behavior. Joel Bakken's book is based on the fact that by definition, corporations as institutions must value those same characteristics. They must behave like psychopaths. They must value what psychopaths value and discourage what psychopaths discourage. Bakken makes the point that this is not a matter of choice for corporations. It's a matter of necessity. If a corporation is to fulfill its ultimate objective, which is to reward its shareholders, then by definition, the rights or the benefits of shareholders become the driving fact, the driving factor, the driving objective, if you will, of a corporation. And if the administration or the leaders of that, if the executives of this corporation don't follow that particular line of thinking, then the shareholders will most likely replace them. So again, it seems to me that the operative issue or objective of Bakken's book is to demonstrate the extent to which corporations as institutions reveal the behavior and the priorities of psychopathic behavior. By implication, then, it would appear that corporations will not do what the public interest wants them to do, requires, unless they are forced to. Yet the fact of the matter is, corporations are, at least in today's world, are relatively immune from regulation. They are left pretty much self-policing. There were certain periods in our society, and of course, Roosevelt's New Deal is a major one. There were certain periods in our society when regulating the behavior of corporations became a political priority. The Progressive Era at the turn of the century, Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson. Regulating the behavior of corporations because, in theory, it seemed corporations were out of control in the late 19th century at the height of the Industrial Revolution. Corporations were treating their employees with abandon, with disregard, with disrespect. And the assumption of government as part of progressivism was that the only way that corporations are going to respect employees' rights and treat employees the way human beings ought to be treated is to force them to do it by engaging in regulation. But as we know, these periods of intense government regulation are usually followed by the swing of the pendulum back in the direction of corporate independence. And so what was gained prior to World War I in terms of progressive reform legislation was in large part undone in the 1920s. And of course, we know that the result in the 1920s was the crash of the market and the beginning of the Great Depression, which engulfed the nation through the 1930s. And we know that in the Depression, FDR came to power and initiated what we call the New Deal, which emphasized once again the need for government to regulate and control the behavior of corporations, the behavior of corporate America. Bakken points out in his first chapter, in looking at the overview of this history of relations between government and corporations in this nation and in Great Britain, where corporations began. Remember the South Sea bubble in the early 18th century. That this regulatory trend associated with the New Deal began to change back to a lack of regulation with the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980. The emergence of Ronald Reagan in the United States and Margaret Thatcher in Great Britain signaled the beginning of the end of government regulation of corporations and society's seeming reliance on corporations to police themselves. The assumption here seemed to be that the only way corporations could fulfill the public good, which was there originally as the reason for their incorporation, is to let them police themselves and not overregulate them. Bakken's thesis. Corporations are institutions which value the characteristics of psychopathic behavior. The one thing all of us know is that psychopaths are incapable of self-control, of doing the right thing. Society needs to control the behavior of psychopaths because psychopaths will not control their own behavior. Yet Bakken's conclusion is, if this is true of psychopaths, how can we expect corporations to do the right thing unless we force them to? Because they are driven by the same value system that drives the psychopath. And there's one additional piece to this equation, it seems to me, that really drives this home. And that is that in our legal system, we have come to legally define corporations as persons. In other words, we have chosen under the law to treat corporations as if they were persons. And this became especially prominent after the Civil War with the passage of the 14th Amendment and the inclusion of the idea that no person can be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And the theory, we've covered this in previous programs, the assumption was that the purpose of the 14th Amendment was to protect the rights and the dignity of ex-slaves. But we know that corporate attorneys came in and used the language of the 14th Amendment to benefit corporations. And increasingly under the law, corporations began to be defined and treated as persons. In effect, then, what the law did was assign to institutions who exhibited and valued psychopathic behavior the legal status of persons, true psychopaths. And that's really the thesis of Bakken's book, and that's the thesis of the movie based on that book, which won an award for documentary in 2004 at the Sundance Film Festival. So again, I think the real issue here is the nature of psychopathic behavior and the extent to which it indeed defines the behavior and the priorities of corporations. And then along with it comes the assignment of the legal status to corporations as persons. Yesterday, I posted on Facebook, on our Facebook page, and a piece, the ingredients of what will probably become an article that I've written on the issue of corporations as persons and corporate behavior as psychopathic behavior. I made reference to Bakken's book, and I pointed out some of the things that we learned from reading Bakken's book, which again is entitled The Corporation, The Pathological Pursuit of Profit and Power. In that book, Bakken deals principally with the issue of the independence of corporations, the ability of corporations to become self-policing. Bakken says in an interview that corporations must be free of government regulation and control, and instead are inspected, quote, a corporation is expected, quote, to do its own thing and hope it constrains itself, unquote. Bakken says the following in an interview: today's corporation as an institution lacks any intrinsic or internal ability to constrain itself morally or ethically. There has basically been a deal, Bakken says, that government would become less involved in demanding that corporations be socially responsible providing that corporations take on the task of regulating themselves and becoming more socially responsible. In other words, Bakken talks about almost an informal deal, arrangement made, where government says to corporations, we won't regulate you provided you make socially responsible behavior a corporate priority. In other words, if you can demonstrate to us that you can be socially responsible, then we will respond to that by minimizing regulation of your behavior. In the piece that I put on Facebook yesterday, I made the statement, talk about trusting the fox to guard the hen house. Bakken tells us that the problem is systemic. It's not conspiratorial. It's not bad people as corporate CEOs, Bakken says. Rather, it's systemic. It's contained in the very nature of corporations as institutions. And it's twofold. First, Bakken tells us corporations must put the interest of shareholders first. That's the contractual obligation that they owe to their investors. When shareholder interests conflict with the best interests of society at large, guess who wins? That's important. And you might say, where is the conflict between social goals and shareholder goals? Let's assume that you're a shareholder in ExxonMobil. Your goal is profit. Your product is fossil fuels. The greatest threat you face is climate control, or efforts to regain control of climate. In other words, you, by definition, in order to continue to reward your shareholders, must deny the science that supports climate change. You have to take a position against it, because to accept it would violate the priorities and self-interest of your shareholders. So consequently, organizations, corporations like ExxonMobil and GM and many of the others. GM, for example, will sometimes make a decision that it's much cheaper to settle the legal fallout from defective automobiles than it would be to improve the emissions, the pollution emissions from automobiles. It'd be much cheaper to deal with the legal results of automobiles that pollute, rather than what would be the social best interest or the public interest, which would be to develop automobiles which pollute less. That could be more expensive. It's more socially conscious. It demonstrates a social conscience. But in terms of shareholder interests, it works directly against their best interests. The second issue, the first one being that corporations must put the interests of their shareholders first. The second issue is that of psychopathic behavior. Everything that makes a corporation what it is and what it does works contrary to morality and ethical standards. Corporation is not a human being. Legally, it's treated as if it were a human being. It has no conscience. Neither does a psychopath. That's the point of Bakken's book. So the combination of those two things, the priority of shareholders and the commitment to the characteristics of psychopathic behavior as being systemic within corporations as institutions, seem to be the driving factors here. As I pursued this, and as I began to focus on it more and more, and concentrate more and more on the priorities, I began to realize that the real issue here is the legal nature of corporations. And those of you who have been regular listeners over the years to the Virtual Center will remember that in one of John Marshall's major opinions, he laid out the definition of a corporation, specifically in the case of Dartmouth College versus Woodward in 1819. You'll recall that we spent quite a bit of time here at the Virtual Center some time ago on Marshall Court decisions. And in the year 1819, there were two major decisions reached by the Marshall Court. One was McCulloch versus Maryland, in which the legality of the United States Bank was upheld by the Marshall Court. And the second one was Dartmouth College versus Woodward, in which the independence and private nature of Dartmouth College was upheld by the Supreme Court and Chief Justice Marshall. Many of you may remember that Daniel Webster was the attorney representing Dartmouth College before the Supreme Court. And the story goes that Daniel Webster made such an impassioned plea for his alma mater that actually it brought tears to John Marshall's eye. That's the story that comes out of this case. But the fact of the matter is, both cases, McCulloch versus Maryland and Dartmouth College versus Woodward, revolved around the fact that the bank in McCulloch and Dartmouth College in the Dartmouth College case were both incorporated as corporations. So in both cases, it's the nature of the corporation, the legal definition of a corporation, that really contributes directly to Marshall's opinion in both of these important cases. In the decision, in the opinion, in Dartmouth College, John Marshall addresses the issues of corporations. I've reproduced 3 paragraphs from Marshall's opinion in Dartmouth College relating to corporations. I'd like to spend some time with you on these 3 paragraphs because I believe that the issues raised by Joel Bakken on the degree to which corporations must be free and independent of regulation on the one hand, and must be able to put the priorities of their shareholders at the top of their list as another consideration, have their origins not in the late 19th century, in the Industrial Revolution and the passage of the 14th Amendment. It is my sense that the real story here about the legality of corporations goes all the way back to 1819 and the decisions reached in McCulloch versus Maryland and Dartmouth College. This paragraph is verbatim from John Marshall's decision in Dartmouth College. Marshall says the following: a corporation is an artificial thing, invisible, intangible, and existing only in contemplation of law. Being the mere creature of law, it possesses only those properties which the charter of its creation confers upon it, either expressly or as incidental to its very existence. The first two sentences of this paragraph. A corporation is a legal creation. It's artificial. It's man-made. It's intangible. It's invisible. It exists only as a matter of law. And since it is a creature of law, it possesses only those properties which the law gave it when the law incorporated it or chartered it. The implication of those two sentences seems to suggest that if government created it, and it only had the properties given to it in its original creation, then Marshall seems to be implying that it's, by definition, subject to the regulation of government. If government created it, and government laid out the purposes for which it was created, then the implication is that government would be the authority that would determine whether, in fact, the corporation was living up to the terms of its creation, of its charter. I'm not an attorney, but it seems to me logic and common sense suggests that Marshall is implying there a legitimate logical role for government in regulating corporations. If you stopped there, if you pulled out those two sentences from Marshall's opinion, you could make the case that corporations' claim to be free and independent of government regulation are bogus. That you can go to John Marshall and you can extract those two sentences and clearly conclude from those two sentences that Marshall defined corporations as creatures of the law and thereby, or therefore, subject to government's regulation in order to ensure that the corporation lived up to the terms of its own creation. But Marshall doesn't stop there. He goes on and says, these are such as are supposed best calculated to affect the object for which it was created. In other words, limiting the corporation to the properties of its own charter would seem to be, Marshall says, best calculated to affect the object for which it was created. by limiting it to the properties its charter gave it, Marshall is saying that would seem to be the best way to ensure that the corporation ended up doing what government gave it a charter to do. Marshall goes on and defines exactly what these properties are. Among the most important, he said, are immortality and, if the expression may be allowed, individuality. Properties by which a perpetual succession of many persons are considered as the same and may act as a single individual. Let me flag this. John Marshall in 1819 is laying the groundwork of the precedent for the interpretation of corporations as persons. Not the 14th Amendment in the late 1860s, but Dartmouth College versus Woodward in 1819. Let me repeat that sentence. Among the most important of the properties corporations must have are immortality and, he says, if the expression may be allowed, individuality. Properties by which a perpetual succession of many persons are considered as the same and may act as a single individual. Translation: for purposes of the law, Marshall is saying, a corporation's immortality demands that it has a right to its own success, its own future. By definition, it would be suicidal to create or charter a corporation to accomplish a particular necessity, a particular good, and then deny it what it needed to preserve itself. So by definition, a corporation has to be able to take on its own survival, to shield itself, protect itself, grow, strengthen itself. In other words, consider its own immortality. A second property, besides immortality, is individuality. And Marshall says what that means is, even though the people change, even though the makeup of the corporation changes from generation to generation, as far as the law is concerned, the corporation must be treated as if it were a person. One person, not different people, but legally all of them are one and the same persons. I want to ask you to join me in thinking about the relationship between those two properties together. And we're right at the end of our program. It looks to be, and I'm checking our clock on the wall here, it looks to be 58 minutes after the hour. So it seems to me that we're going to have to begin to end today's program and set this up tomorrow. So let me leave you then with this challenge or this issue. Think about the relationship between immortality and individuality. Think about the dual properties of a corporation's right to defend itself and preserve itself, and at the same time to be treated legally over time as if it were one and the same person. Think about how those two things would interact and relate. And we'll get into that when we come back tomorrow. It's 59 minutes after the hour. Again, I want to thank you for being with us here at the Virtual Center on this holiday, on this Memorial Day. It is a beautiful day here. So far, we're looking for some rain apparently later, but right now it's delightful. I want to thank you for tuning in. I want to invite you to join us tomorrow. Let me remind you that on Tuesdays we begin our program 30 minutes later. So in the East, our start time tomorrow will be 1:30 p.m. rather than 1 p.m. For Bob Kincaid and the folks at Head On, for the Virtual Center, and for myself particularly, I want to thank you for your continued support of the Virtual Center. I hope you have a wonderful evening. Be kind to each other, and thank you.